So, Mike, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is
social perspective taking.
Welcome to the ADHD Guys podcast with Mike McLeod of Grow Now ADHD and Ryan Wexelblatt of ADHD Dude. Learn about parenting kids with ADHD from two male licensed professionals who specialize in ADHD and executive functions. No fluffy parenting advice. Only practical information that will help you help your child.
Why don't we start off by explaining exactly what perspective taking is? So I actually like to use this definition that I learned from Michelle Garcia Winner, the creator of social thinking. And it goes like this. So I have thoughts, right? You have thoughts. I know that you're thinking about me. So I adapt my behavior to help you to have good thoughts about me.
The thinking of you, thinking of me program.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thinking of you, thinking of me. Yeah.
Beautifully said.
So, Mike, why don't you explain what social executive function skills are and why perspective taking is one of the foundational social executive function skills?
So social executive functioning is something that is still so incredibly misunderstood and not talked about enough. Social executive functioning is not social skills, like these external social skills that a lot of kids are working on in these highly structured, adult-directed social skills groups. We're talking about the real internal social executive functioning. And it's so important that people understand that this is an area of executive functioning. We still cannot keep looking at executive functioning as time management, organization, clean backpacks, using a calendar, and that's it, the old smart but scattered way of looking at it. We have to understand that executive functioning is a crucial set of life skills, the greatest predictor of success we have for human beings, and it affects all areas of life. I like to break it down into three separate groups of academic executive functioning, which most people know about, home executive functioning, and social executive functioning. So the three areas. And perspective taking is really the number one social executive function skill. This is the ability, like you discussed before, to understand the thoughts and feelings that we put into others' heads. So we talked about in a previous episode how difficult self-awareness is for many, many kids with ADHD, which is understanding your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own emotions, your own strengths, your own needs. Let's magnify that and double that. And now this is the social executive functioning skill to understand others' thoughts and the types of thoughts and feelings we're giving to others. So I kind of refer to this in many ways as like metacognition plus. So metacognition and self-evaluation is really hard for kids with ADHD. Now we're asking them to understand other people's thoughts and feelings and the thoughts and feelings we give them based on our actions, our behaviors, and our language.
So one of the things, Mike, I want to start off with here is talking about the fact, and this is something that fascinates me, is why some kids with ADHD struggle with perspective taking, but others do not. That's something that's not exactly clear to us yet. But I think what we should do is talk about what perspective taking challenges look like in each, age group. So in early elementary school, what this often looks like is being bossy or controlling in play situations. And often one of the things that we hear is for a lot of kids with ADHD who struggle with perspective taking, on the playground during recess, they'll try to be bossy and tell other kids what to do. And then when the other kids respond negatively to them, well, then they tell an adult that they're being bullied, or they tell their parents they're being bullied. And the reason they're saying that is because they have difficulty with perspective taking and understanding that other kids do not like being bossed around or being yelled at. So if they say, I'm not playing with you, that's not being bullied, right? They're having a reaction to your behavior. And that's, I think, a perfect example of what perspective taking challenges look like in early elementary school. The one other thing, Mike, I wanted to say about this is I always say that there's three entry points into when social executive function challenges really come to the surface. And the first one is second grade. So approximately age 7 to 8. So why second grade? Well, that's because developmentally, that's when kids start to understand that not everybody's my friend. So, think about the language we use, right, in kindergarten and first grade. We say, okay, friends, we're going to recess, okay, friends, it's time to get out our social studies books. So we kind of pretend with kids that we're all friends. And then what happens in, with second grade is kids start to understand social hierarchy, and they start to understand, she's mean to me, he's weird, I like him, I don't like her. So often for kids who struggle with perspective taking, other kids start to have this negative response to them in second grade, if it hasn't happened already.
Absolutely. And this is really the age group where those social groups and those cliques tend to start to form, and kids will start to bond over particular interests and shared interests. The kids that play sports together, the kids that are in certain clubs together, whatever it may be. And then if you struggle with social perspective taking, at a younger age, this is going to start to become people's viewpoints of you. And the whole thing with school is you're kind of surrounded by the same exact people every single day, year after year after year. So you develop that sort of reputation. So what we tend to see with kids with ADHD, where they will sort of hyper focus on very specific things, and many of them will learn to just get a rise out of somebody. So whether they're just do whatever they can to get a laugh, and if they can make someone laugh at their joke, that person likes me, and it gives them some sort of stimulation and validation that I made somebody laugh. And they'll hyper focus on, acting silly at their own expense, because they don't understand that they're giving other people kind of cringy thoughts of, yeah, I may be laughing, but this is not someone I want to fully associate with and spend my free time with.
So, Mike, to your point, I have a saying, that for kids with ADHD, negative attention, positive attention, they'll take either one. Would prefer
Correct.
Positive attention, but they're completely fine with negative attention. So that example you gave of, kind of laughing at you versus laughing with you, I think that's a perfect example of that. They're getting attention, and even though it might be giving other kids, what we would call cringy thoughts, meaning other kids feel uncomfortable around you or they don't want to be around you because of their perspective taking difficulty, they don't really realize that.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And these are the kids that will hyper focus on, memes and jokes, and they'll do shock value language about very, shock value subjects just to sort of get a rise out of people. And, perspective taking perspective taking challenges can present itself in so many different ways. Not only is it on the playground during an unstructured time, but even during structured time in the classroom when the teacher's trying to teach. The teacher could be teaching and the child could, blurt something out, and one or two kids may laugh or they may get a negative reaction, whatever it may be. But that blurting out and that lack of perspective taking about how the calling out negatively impacts the teacher, how it throws the class off schedule, and really impacts the entire class as a society as a whole, it's really hard for these kids to understand and inhibit those impulses.
So, Mike, the next thing I want to bring up is the second time I see this perspective taking difficulty really rise to the surface is often in fifth grade. I always say that for the second half of fifth grade is when we start to really see things go south socially. And I want to explain the reasons why I believe that happens. Well, number one, social expectations go up in fifth grade. And so that's approximately age 10 to 11, because kids become more aware of wanting to be part of, a same gender peer group. Girls start to hang out with girls more. Boys start to hang out with boys more. I think for a lot of kids, with the beginning of puberty and they're thinking about middle school, they're becoming more socially aware and more self-conscious. And for kids who may be socially immature and struggle with perspective taking, they're not, kind of moving along on that same developmental trajectory as their same age peers. And they might not know how to navigate these, new kind of groups of, boys hanging out together, girls hanging out together. So often is when, at least for boys in particular, I tend to see the second half of fifth grade is when friendships start to dwindle away, I often see.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you would be in agreement with me that this is probably one of your favorite things to talk about. This is probably one of your favorite topics in ADHD is social executive functioning and the social dynamics of ADHD. I know for me personally, every time I learn about social executive functioning as an adult, it just brings me back to myself as an adolescent and a child. And my own experience with my ADHD was, my struggles with social executive functioning. This was definitely my biggest area of need, especially in middle school and high school, just like you're talking about. So this is probably one of my favorite things to talk about and discuss and work with parents and work with families on. But of course, my experience with it is my experience. It's not something that I could, use to help somebody else, but it's just overall, something that I really connect very deeply with. And these sort of, loose milestones you're talking about, this is such great information for parents to know, because these kids get to a certain point and, this is where the individuals around them are becoming a little bit more socially savvy, and they have this developmental delay of social executive functions as a whole. But in other areas, they could be, developing. So this is the age also where kids are going to manipulate their parents to say, hey, kids don't go outside anymore. You need to buy me a phone. You need to buy me an Xbox. You need to buy me a PlayStation. Everyone just hangs out online. Kids aren't doing groups or going outside and playing sports and riding bikes. But kids are still out doing that. It's not 100% of kids sitting in the basement playing games. This is where that lack of social perspective taking can turn into a child developing a very small comfort zone that they manipulate their parents to stay in as much as possible.
Mike, I think that's an excellent point because, what I would also say is if, fifth grade, typically, if not, middle school, sixth grade, this is when, to your point, where we tend to see social isolation start for that very reason you just described. Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about what perspective taking looks like in middle school. But to the other thing, Mike, I wanted to mention to your point, this is absolutely my favorite subject to talk about, but also this is when I often, for the families who come to our summer camp, this is often the age group that, families start showing interest, or not start showing interest, they start coming to camp, which is, the end of fifth grade. And, when I work with kids, for, my groups and stuff, this is fifth grade, sixth grade is a big age for this, for the parents who kind of discover it earlier on, So in middle school, one of the things I think is interesting, we often see how difficulty with perspective taking presents itself is difficulty working in groups.
Yep.
One of the things, Mike, on my camp application you've seen is one of the questions I ask is, number one, how would this student's peers describe them? And how would the student's classmates describe them? And the reason I ask that is because really the judge of your child's social skills is not an adult. It's not you. It's their same age peers. So I want to know how, the student comes across to their same age peers. And then the other question I, ask is about working in groups, because I want to know how they present working in groups. Because if you struggle with perspective taking, when you're doing group work, which increases in middle school, it's often going to look like you're struggling to work in groups or take ideas from others, or you're getting upset, right, when they're not doing what you want.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's also a question that I love to pose to some of the middle school and high school students that I'm working with directly is basically, if I were to ask anonymously one of your peers that knows you well, give me 3 words to describe Jonathan, what 3 words do you hope they would say? And whatever they say, those 3 words, like, oh, I think he would say kind, funny, and caring, or something like that. And then sort of developing a plan of action of, okay, what can I do to be congruent with those thoughts? Like, how can I develop a plan where I can get people to actually say those things about me and to become more aware of, yeah, I actually do have an impact on others. And this is the ADHD brain in a nutshell. It's this lack of social perspective taking, lack of cause and effect thinking, and really understanding, hey, the things that I say, the things that I do actually impact others. And people are going to have thoughts about me. I could be the most well-meaning person that has no malicious thoughts and wants to be friends with everybody and wants to have kindness. But if I'm making, shock value jokes and I'm interrupting and I'm, being bossy without even realizing it, we're going to start pushing people away. And that social isolation could really lead into screen addiction and a further delay in the development of other crucial skills.
Mike, one of the things I think we should also mention, a core feature of difficulty with perspective taking that presents both in elementary and middle school, as we know, is having one-sided conversations or talking at others. So just talking at others about your interests. And one of the things is, parents often say, I'm sure you've heard this a million times as I have, they'll say, my son does really well with younger kids, or with adults, but it's same age peers they struggle with. And here's why, and here's how I explain that. I say, younger kids have less social expectations than their same age peers, and they will often look to older kids as, a role model. So when they have less social expectations and they just kind of know less socially, right, that's going to make it easier for a kid with perspective taking challenges to relate to them, besides the fact that they might be socially immature to begin with. the other part of that as well is that, younger kids will listen to you ramble about, Minecraft or whatever it is and just kind of be oblivious to it. And then when we're talking about adults, well, adults are going to be polite and they're going to listen to you ramble on as well, and adults don't care if you show interest in them. Younger kids, might not care if you show interest in them because you're giving them attention, right? But if you ramble on to your same age peers about Minecraft or whatever, and you're not showing interest in them, that's difficulty with perspective taking, and other kids are not going to realize necessarily that you want to be part of the group or you want to be friends because you're not showing any interest in them. You're just talking about what interests you.
Exactly. And this is bringing us back to that same old topic of the importance of varied experiences for these kids. If you have an ADHD child that just wakes up, goes to school, comes home, stays home, and spends hours on Fortnite, Roblox, Minecraft, video games, when it comes to peer relationships, how are they supposed to build real social relatedness and build real relationships when all they can talk about is the game, because that's all that consumes their brain is this one YouTuber or this one game or whatever. Boys need, people don't just talk about it enough. You talk about it a lot. How badly boys need relationships at these age. At this, you can't, that cannot be understated enough. It's literally food, water, shelter, relationships. Boys need this. They need other boys they can have conversations with that they would never talk to their mom about or their dad about or a family member about. Someone that you can go out with and, talk about those ridiculous thoughts that pop into your head all day during puberty and other, things that, you're not comfortable talking about with other people. Like, all of us have ridiculous, silly, wild imaginations, and having a friend that you can talk to about and say like, hey, like I was thinking about this, I was going through this, and being able to be vulnerable to someone and talk to someone. Teenage boys and middle school, high school boys need those relationships. They can't just play video games together and talk about memes and talk about YouTube. They need people outside of the family to have that safety net. And without perspective taking skills, social executive functioning, that's going to be very hard to build that net.
Mike, I'm so glad you brought this up because I think it's really easy for parents to understand that girls need that. But I think a lot of parents lose sight of the fact, to your point, that boys need that. And one of the things, Mike, as you were talking, what I was thinking about is when you've posted about before on social media about, get your kids off video games. They need to have a life outside of video games, or that video game friends are not real friends. And, when I've seen this pushback from some parents, when you've posted this saying like, oh no, my son has real friends. I'm like, they are real friends, and I think a lot of parents just believe that, yeah, these are real friendships. And like, to your point, no, if all you can talk about is one game and there is no getting to know each other, there's no intimacy in terms of the relationship because you don't know how to show interest in others because of your perspective taking difficulties, right? That is what we would call a video game relationship, right?
Yeah.
It's not a friendship, it's a video game relationship.
And let's be totally honest for a second. That is that parent rationalizing it in their brain. It's a lot more easier for them to just rationalize in their brain, this video game is helping my child in some way, than to take the games away and tell the kid to go outside or join a group and have to deal with those behaviors and watch your young boy get mad at you and have to deal with my son no longer being my best friend all the time. That's pretty much exactly what it is. So not wanting to persevere through those behaviors or even deal with those behaviors. I call it avoiding the tantrum. You're avoiding the tantrum because you're just rationalizing it in your head. Yeah, he plays Minecraft until 2 a.m., but it's really gained his confidence. He's gotten a couple of battle royale wins, and he's built amazing things in Minecraft, and it's just really raised his confidence. Sure, yeah, they can play some games, but if that becomes the only thing they can talk about and the only social experiences they have, that's a serious, serious problem, because what's going to happen at college? So they're going to sit in their dorm room all day and just have online friends and never go outside and have a real college experience. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen at the workplace? That they're going to have to work in a team. Like 99% of all jobs, you're going to have coworkers and to build relationships with them. At the workplace, you could be a great worker, but if all of your coworkers kind of see you as like a loner and you're not adding to the community of the workplace, you could easily be replaced. You have to have social executive functions in life. It's a crucial skill that is highly correlated to success and independence.
Mike, let's go back for a minute and talk about what, perspective taking challenges look like a little more in middle school and high school. One of the other things that I thought of was, and I'm sure you've seen this, is, kids who argue with the teacher in class.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Or who go on these long tangents, right? And kind of monopolize the class time. I think that's another, sign of difficulty with perspective taking that we see in middle and high school. I think, the other thing, just to what you were talking about before, is this lack of showing interest in others. So one of the things, like I always teach, in my school year programs and at camp is, I teach the boys that, at your age, whether you're in middle school or high school, other guys are getting together outside of school and they're texting each other and they're having conversations. And if you're not doing that, right, then you're not showing interest in them and they're not going to know that you want to be friends, right? So because of your perspective taking difficulty, right, you might not be thinking about their thoughts or feelings, but how else? They can't read your mind. They're not going to want to know that you want to be friends if you're not investing and showing interest in the relationship.
And that's the biggest thing is, one of the biggest ways social executive functioning and perspective taking presents itself is, are you showing an interest in others? That's the one common theme with elementary, middle, and high. Are you trying to get to know someone as a unique individual to build that relationship? So an aspect of social perspective taking is social reciprocity. So do you understand 50-50 relationships, or do you only want to talk about what you want to talk about? Do you want to dominate the conversations? Or, parents can probably connect with this, is every single time your child talking to you, they're on their phone, looking down at their phone, talking to you. That's a lack of perspective taking because you don't understand the thoughts you're giving to that person, that you're very uninterested in them. You don't care what they have to say. You're not giving that person the time of day by putting the phone away and getting up to look at them. And we're not saying you have to stare at them. We're not hardcore eye contact people, but being able to have the decency to get up and look at somebody when you're talking to them, that's a lack of perspective taking. And you mentioned in the classroom, yelling at a teacher, interrupting, those kinds of things. There's also perspective taking at home and kids cursing and saying really, really messed up things to their parents. That's also a sign of a lack of perspective taking because you're not picking up on how your negative words negatively impact your parents and your behaviors and your breaking things and physical aggression, the thoughts and feelings you're giving your parents. So perspective taking, it's a social executive function, but it's so unbelievably important, it's going to affect academic executive functioning and home executive functioning. This is a crucial life skill.
Mike, as one of the things I wanted to mention is last year I did a presentation for the counseling staff at Arizona State University here. And this is one of the things that I talked about because it's something that, when I said, what do you want me to go over, in the presentation? And they said, one of the things that the professors bring to our attention a lot is when some of the, neurodiverse students, when they're argumentative or they're monopolizing class time. So this is something that I really focused on with the counseling staff. And because I wanted them to understand you have to address perspective taking, and help, the students understand that their behavior is making their classmates uncomfortable, in class. So I think to your point, this is not something that magically goes away in adulthood. Can perspective taking get better with age? Absolutely. But to varying degrees. And look, I think most people listening to this or watching this right now have met an adult who doesn't understand how they're coming across to others or has a propensity to say offensive things, right? That's all difficulty with perspective taking.
Yeah, and social media has just amplified that. We all know the people that basically use Facebook like it's Twitter, and they're posting, different things on it all the time. And now with social media and the internet, we have something called a digital footprint. So if you have a lack of perspective taking, you could put something online and you don't understand the cause and effect, and it could come to affect you 5-10 years down the road. So that's an added layer onto this of, teaching them perspective taking, especially when they're posting things as themselves on social media. So I'm sure many of you have heard stories of, kids writing things and getting in trouble based on, a lack of perspective taking and a lack of understanding how it's going to impact others. The same reasons why these kids don't correlate cause and effect of, oh, if I get my homework done, then I'll be able to play games. If I study, then I'll get a good grade. It's the same thing of, hey, if I show interest in someone and I, put effort towards wanting to get to know someone as a unique individual, I'm going to put good thoughts in their head, and they're going to want to be around me, and they're probably also going to show an interest in me. This cause and effect thinking is so unbelievably important, and the lack of cause and effect thinking is exactly why ADHD is so highly correlated with so many really scary things. And this social perspective taking piece is huge because it's something that, like you said, is not going to get better with time. And the typical social skills group, which we talked about in a previous episode, which makes ADHD behaviors worse in many ways, the typical structured, adult-directed social skills group is probably going to work on turn taking and, different adult-directed things like that, with never a focus on the internal social executive functions.
So let's Mike, let's do this. Let's explain first before we get into that, because I want to talk about what people can do to help build perspective taking and what works and what doesn't work. But one of the things I think we need to help people understand first is to the extent of how poorly this topic is understood. And you and I have both seen plenty of kids, right, who have been misdiagnosed with autism specifically because of this perspective taking piece, and because a mental health professional does not understand that kids with ADHD struggle with perspective taking, so they automatically presume that they have autism.
Yes.
So much of that is that correlates to this, tremendous rise we've seen in these later autism diagnoses. What it really comes down to is mental health professionals of all levels not understanding social executive functioning, and particularly perspective taking.
Absolutely. And this goes back to our common theme, and part of the big reasons why we started this podcast in the first place is because ADHD is so unbelievably understood. There's mental health professionals that simply say it's an attention deficit, it's hyperactivity, it's inattentiveness. You're going to need an IEP for this, a 504 for this, and you're good. And there's no discussion about the social impacts, the behaviors at home, and the dysregulation you're constantly dealing with. So this ends up leading to extra diagnoses that are not necessarily accurate or needed, and other therapies that aren't helping and are not real recommendations for ADHD. So this is something that is really not a part of training. You can ask most mental health therapists, how often did you talk about social executive functioning in your graduate program, your doctorate program, those kinds of things? Probably not at all. And this is something that needs to be discussed because it is leading to inappropriate diagnoses and inappropriate therapies that are not helping the bottom line of making friends and keeping friends in the natural environment.
Mike, I did a full day training once in Philly, and it was all clinicians, a master's level, doctorate level, and probably there was 50 people there. And I asked them, I said, raise your hand if you learned about, perspective taking in graduate school. And one person raised their hand out of 50, and it had just happened to be a neuropsych.
There you go.
So to your point about that, right, people really do not learn about this. The other thing, Mike, I want to mention, because this drives me crazy more than anything, is when I hear parents, and even more what drives me crazy, when I hear professionals say that a kid has a lack of empathy. Because essentially, when you say somebody has a lack of empathy, what you're basically doing is you're saying that you're kind of taking away their humanity, for lack of a better term, okay? And that is something, so many kids who struggle with perspective taking, people think that they have a lack of empathy. And in my experience, kids with ADHD tend to have a tremendous amount of empathy, but they may struggle with perspective taking. But I just want everyone to understand that, if your child seems to not show empathy, that doesn't mean they don't have empathy. It means they struggle with perspective taking. Okay. So last thing before we get into what works and what doesn't work, I think it's important to help people understand, the differences in, these social executive function skills and perspective taking, between somebody with ADHD and somebody with autism. And I want to use this quick story as an example. So I was working with a young adult once, okay, who was diagnosed with what we used to call Asperger's. And this guy was tall. He was probably like 6'5". So I had an appointment with him. So I come to my office. He got there before me, and he's standing outside my office, this 6'5" tall guy with like a parka with the hood pulled all the way down over his eyes, right? Just like kind of lurching over my door to my office. And, this is a hallway with other businesses in it. And I said to him when he came in, I said, what do you think other people's thoughts were when they saw this 6'5" guy with a parka, wearing a parka inside, pulled all the way down over his face? What do you think their thoughts were? And he was like, I don't know. I was like, do you think it might have made them uncomfortable because that's not something they typically see, as a 6'5" guy wearing a parka indoors pulled over his face? And that's an example of difficulty with perspective taking in, somebody with autism. So the way I describe it is this: somebody with autism can have perspective taking to varying degrees, or it can be almost non-existent. They can learn it, okay? Whereas somebody with ADHD, a kid with ADHD, has perspective taking skills. However, they're lagging and they're used inconsistently. So the bottom line is people with autism tend to struggle much more with this than people with ADHD, because the skill might not just necessarily have been built from the foundation. So, Mike, let's talk about first what does not work to help build perspective taking skills. So wherever you want to start.
Of course. So we can tell you right now, what does not work is talk therapy. So what does not work is going to a mental health therapist or a talk therapist and simply just talking about, or practicing, some sort of role playing with an adult on what to do in the natural environment with peers.
Mike, explain more about why role playing doesn't work. I think it's important for people to hear that.
Of course. So role playing is outside, basically, playing roles. First of all, they're doing it with an adult, and the adult's going to have adult responses to the child. And no matter how hard they try or how cool they think they are going to have adult responses to the child during the role play. And it's not something that is going to stick in their working memory, which is the core deficit of ADHD, and transfer into the natural environment. So it's external practice of something, but it's not teaching the child about internal perspective taking and to develop that internal voice. So you have to have that internal voice along with the perspective taking to be competent in that social scenario. So it's not focusing on the internal skills, it's external practice. It's not focusing on the internal system of checks and balances that are needed when you're having a social dialogue.
Not to mention, all social interactions are context dependent. They change based on the environment, who's there. So if you're role playing, well, then you're going to have to role play every single, possible scenario, which obviously is
correct.
Possible. Mike, real quickly, tell us about social skills groups, because I'm sure every parent listening or watching this who has a kid who struggles socially has either been referred to a social skills group or they took their child to a social skills group. What does the research data tell us on this subject?
Of course. So with schools, I think it's very important that we discuss that you see this so often at schools. Schools do this simply because it's easy. Okay, let's take a bunch of kids that have these social goals in their IEP and let's lump them into a big group with, one clinician or two clinicians. And so we can check that box that everybody got their federally mandated services kind of thing. And it's adult directed, and they're focused on really just outdated social skills of eye contact and topic maintenance and circles of communication and topic maintenance and things like that. Things that, again, do not transfer into the natural environment because of how you so perfectly said, social experiences, especially for adolescents and kids and teens, is fluid, and it's not something that can be practiced in a structured environment. It has to be something that is done in the natural environment, 100%, because you're not going to be able to just come up with a scenario and say, oh, if this happens, and then be able to use it in the natural environment. And that the whole fact that these social skills groups are adult directed, it's keeping these kids prompt dependent on the adults who is directing it, where as soon as that adult's not there to assist them and prompt them in the natural environment, how are they going to use those skills?
Mike, I have a lot of school counselors reach out to me and they want help with this. And what I always say to them is this: if you want to help kids socially in school, and you absolutely can, go outside during recess with them. Don't do a social skills group in your office. You have to be, to your point, in that natural environment and teach them there in the moment, and that's
absolutely
what we do at my summer camp and in my school year programs. I mean, it's what you guys do as well. It's teaching in natural environments in the moment.
Exactly. So the way that we decorated and set up our clinic here, it's to make it look like, someone's living room or someone's basement where they're going to hang out with someone indoors. And we're constantly going out into the natural environment to practice in those ways. And everything uses the principles of nonverbal and verbal working memory and these internal skills, and nothing is adult directed. That's the most important thing. So there's one-on-one time to practice and review those kinds of things. But when in the natural environment, we're not directing them to do what we see fit as the adult. We're letting the kids be kids. We're letting them hanging out as kids are supposed to. These hangout groups, as opposed to a structured social skills group, that's what's going to help them be able to do things away from the adult help.
And to add on to Mike's point, the research data is very clear on this, that office clinic-based social skills groups do not help kids with ADHD, because for the exact reason Mike is explaining, because it's not a natural environment sitting around in an office talking about social skills, or, playing a game and saying, okay, you ask him a question, now you ask her a question, right? Give him a compliment. That is not how we communicate organically. And there's even research, Mike, that you've brought up that shows social skills groups for kids with ADHD, if there's kids with behavior challenges in them, can actually make, the kids who don't have behavior challenges, it can make them develop them, right? It can actually make things worse, not better. So I'm sorry to all the SLPs out there, but for kids with ADHD, the research data is clear that there's no benefit to social skills groups for kids with ADHD.
Exactly. And, like I said earlier, it's very easy for these schools to do. And then it's also very easy for, outside professionals to do, to have these social skills groups after school, in the evenings, and on weekends. But once again, are they bringing into the principles of social executive functioning? And, one quick thing that all you listeners out there can do is you can ask yourself, okay, how long has my son been doing social skills groups for now? How long have they been in social skills groups? What are they doing in them? And has his time in the social skills group increased the number of friends and social interactions he's having naturally? Has his number of friends increased? Is he texting people? Is he hanging out with people after school? Is he going to birthday parties? Is he going places, doing things? If there's no cause and effect here of time spent in a group and you're seeing improvement in the natural environment, then what's happening? Something has to change.
And Mike, you know how many parents have said to me, well, I don't think the group is helping at all, but he likes going. And I said, well, if he likes going because it's social, then save your money and put him in an activity.
100%.
Right. You don't need to be paying for a clinical service that is not helpful just because he likes going. Find something more affordable.
Exactly. The only difference.
World environment.
Yeah, the only difference there is that the parents are going to sign them up, and the parents are going to have to deal with those behaviors of when they sign them up. That's how the parents, he likes going to the group, let's keep him there, he's happy there. This other thing is cheaper and just as beneficial to my child, but I'm going to have to deal with the behaviors when I tell him I've now signed him up for something. So the parents are avoiding the tantrum again.
So let's talk quickly about some things that do help teach perspective taking. So number one, we know that teaching in the moment can help. And as Mike mentioned, helping to teach cause and effect thinking. So in my Socially Smarter webinar course, I have something in there called the Clutch Neutral Cringy Figure Outer, which is basically a tool to help teach cause and effect. It's to help, your child understand, like, this is what you said, or this is what you did based on the context of the situation. This is how other kids responded to you. And this is why they responded to you that way. Because if we're going to teach perspective taking, we have to teach cause and effect. And I think having a visual aid to do that, to kind of, spell things out clearly, really helps. And that's why I created that. I also use I created something called the Clutch to Cringe-O-Meter, which is kind of like, this thermometer that shows how people's thoughts about us can change based on our words and behaviors. And part of the reason I did that is because I want kids to understand that even if you didn't start off well with some kids, you can help change their thoughts about you based on, what you say and what you do. Not 100%, right? But we can influence people's thoughts about us, right? By adapting our behavior, in a way. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're a parent at home listening, one thing you might want to get comfortable doing, in the natural environment during conversations with your child is to be very clear and direct. When you said that, it made me think this. When you did that, it made me think that. And even if, you think it may hurt their feelings or whatever, it's important to be very direct with them and to come at it from a caring and loving perspective, of course, but be very clear with them about the cause and effect of when you did this, it made me feel that. And then, if they stay regulated and you're able to have a deeper conversation after that, hopefully short and sweet, about, hey, if you were to say something like that around peers, it would probably make them think these things. So, kind of externalizing your self-talk, externalizing your thoughts, the thoughts that your kids are giving you in your head, the feelings they're giving you. They can't read your mind. They can't read your feelings. Make it very clear and open to them when they did this, when they made this choice, they gave you these thoughts, they gave you these feelings, and just make it very clear and concise for them and get in the habit of letting them know that they have an impact on you.
So what Mike is describing is something else actually I teach in Socially Smarter, which is sharing your internal dialogue around perspective taking. So you're modeling for them what your perspective taking sounds like, internally for you, right? Because that's going to help them develop a greater understanding of perspective taking. The other thing, Mike, I want to add to this is, I'm sure we've both heard parents say, well, I don't want to address this because I don't want to hurt his feelings or I don't want to hurt her self-esteem. And my answer to that is always this. So either you can teach your child this or they can learn it from their peers. But if they learn it from their peers are not going to be empathetic and understanding. So
Correct.
I believe it's much better that they learn it from somebody who they know loves them unconditionally rather than learning it possibly with social ramifications like peer rejection.
Exactly. You're going to have much more benefit and much more success using all types of ADHD parent coaching strategies with your child if you don't constantly try to tiptoe around behaviors. That's the number one thing, is if you are just comfortable with yourself as a loving parent, using affective calmness and presenting things in a loving, caring way, even if you think it may hurt the child or hurt their feelings a little bit or push them out of their comfort zone or get them a little upset or make them a little uncomfortable and feel discomfort. Once you learn to and gain the comfort to not tiptoe around behaviors, tiptoe around their emotions, and you can really take things on head on, you're going to start to see a lot more success.
And Mike, one of the things, to quote Michelle Garcia Winner again, she, one time I heard her say, teaching social competency is teaching accountability to others, really. And I think that's an important point, that this goes beyond just making friends. This is about how we function in the world. Because as we know, one of the best predictors of future success in life is your ability to form social relationships.
Exactly. Yeah. And Michelle Garcia Winner has some great information out there. Also, feel free to Google her name and look at some of her information. But a lot of it revolves around social executive functioning and understanding these, what you are thinking about me sorts of things. So, a lot of what I've learned has been from a lot of her research.
That's what got me started in the field. Absolutely.
There you go.
So, Mike, I think the last thing we should, talk about is, often when, I've posted things about this on social media, we get comments like, well, I don't want him to follow the crowd, or I don't want her to be a people pleaser, or, I just want her to love herself and not care what other people think about her. And I have to say, I'm just going to be blunt about this. Number one, I think to say, I don't want him to follow the crowd, because you're teaching social competency, because you're teaching perspective taking, that doesn't mean you're teaching your child to be a follower. It means you're teaching them to understand others' thoughts, okay? And as for the whole thing about, I just want them to love themselves and not care what other people think about them, I'm sorry to tell you that our self-concept is based on, whether others want to be around us or not, if they enjoy being around us. So if you think that your child is going to love themselves because you tell them how wonderful they are, but their behavior is off-putting to everyone and none of their peers want to be around them, I'm sorry to say you're being very naive.
Of course. And this is one of those things that's constantly pushed on social media and all this of, oh, I don't care what people think about me. I'm always myself. Everybody cares what people think about you because we live in a society. We live in a society and people's opinions of you matter. It's as simple as that. And, and you want to be, people need relationships. Even the most introvert of introverts, you need people to talk to. No one does things by themselves. This is a teamwork society, community we live in. So, you're not going to be able to get through in life without having relationships. So this is such an important thing. And, parents saying that is, again, they're rationalizing in their mind, oh, I don't need to push them. I don't need to make them uncomfortable because I kind of like how they don't care what other people think. I don't want them to follow the crowd. That's them just rationalizing it in their mind so they don't have to follow through on these parent coaching recommendations that are hard also on the parent.
And Mike, last thing I want to mention here is that when you try to teach your child perspective taking, okay, that your child is most likely going to get defensive or have a negative reaction, as Mike mentioned. But understand, this is not the time to get pulled into the argument or the reasoning or the negotiation vortex with them. And even if they don't respond well, know that they are hearing what you're saying, okay? And it's okay if they respond negatively to you, because this might be a huge source of shame for them. So, you're the safe person to take it out on. So just keep that in mind, and don't stop teaching them this just because they have a negative reaction to it. Okay. This is so important, to have fulfilling social relationships in life. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is social perspective taking. This is obviously a very important topic and something that is so wildly misunderstood. So if you have a child who's in a structured social skills group at school as per their IEP, or they're in a play group or a social skills group outside of school, or if they're in none of those things and you see your child really struggling where all of their friends are virtual, all of their friends are on video games, and they're just coming home, staying home after school, start to think more about perspective taking and social executive functioning and how this is a skill that is not going to get better with time, and it is a major predictor of success, happiness, and self-worth and self-image.
I think that's a great place to stop, Mike. And if you don't mind, I want to give a little plug for the social skills playlist at the ADHD Dude YouTube channel. All right, everyone, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about Mike's practice, Grow Now ADHD, please visit his website at grownowadhd.com. To learn about the services Ryan provides, please visit adhddude.com. You can find Mike on Instagram at grownowadhd. And you can find Ryan at the ADHD Dude YouTube channel. The ADHD Guys podcast and content posted by either Grow Now ADHD or ADHD Dude is presented solely for general informational and educational purposes. The use of information on this podcast is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, licensed mental health professional, or other qualified professional, diagnosis, or treatment. Listeners should not disregard or delay in obtaining professional advice for any medical or mental health condition they or their child may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.